I sometimes read public domain books here on Leaves of Glen, and they were written a long time ago, so they're usually racist or sexist or bigoted. But in there somewhere and all that is a story, and that's why those stories are famous. Other times, I read works from independent authors, and they're delightfully not racist, but they might have adult language or adult situations. So that's your warning, but I'm sure you are grown up enough to handle it. Don't write to me complaining. Well, upcoming job loss, or layoff or whatever, is forcing me to tighten my belt. Not to tighten it enough where I won't still go buy a new iPhone 12 this Friday, because I'm an idiot. But everything else, I'm tightening it up. Tightening up the groceries. Tightening up other spending on fun things for kids. And random stuff, like, I'm just going to rent another movie for no reason on Apple, whatever. But nope, now that's got to get all wrapped up. And one of them is heat. Last winter, swimming in money, would just crank the heat up and bathe in the beautiful warm air as it caressed my skin. And I'd laugh to myself as I spin around in a circle, waving my arms around, not caring what I'm doing to the earth. Or how my hubris plays out in the grand scheme of other people who are suffering and don't have heat. Nope. Just enjoyed myself. Well, now I gotta tighten that up too. So I got the heat down to almost nothing, and I'm basically walking around in a sweater that I've been living in for days, so that smells bad. And my nose tip is cold. Oh, and shaving my face, as I've been complaining about the last couple episodes, my lips and cheeks, that normally have hair on them, are just cold. I can feel like waves of cold air go across them that I haven't felt in years. Is that something I dealt with in the past? As I'm speaking right now, I can feel my breath from my mouth hitting my chin. It's weird, and I don't like it, so it makes me feel probably more cold than I really am. But this is not suffering. As I said before, other people are suffering far worse than this, and I'm just being a giant, whiny baby, infantilizing myself. All because of a layoff. Which hopefully I'll find something. Well, we're done. I got nothing else to say. I got my friend coming over tonight. We're gonna watch The Haunting of Hell House, which is our yearly tradition. And that's pretty much it. I got no other news. Oh, well, the whole heat thing is because it's freezing outside and it's snowing. I don't know if I already said that. It has been snowing off and on for a couple days, but today's just been a nice, steady stream of snow, covering everything and pissing me off. Because I got to go out and grocery shop at some point, and I don't want to go out in the snow. It means I got to put on a jacket. I'm not ready for a jacket yet. See, these are not problems. But here I am complaining. Ah, Christ. Let's just move on to the story. Some authors don't get a lot of love on Wikipedia. It goes to show that as time progresses, all are slowly forgotten. People who were once of a certain amount of fame lessen over time, and only truly the best of the best stand out. Like Henry VIII. No one's going to forget him. But, King George, who was the monarch in England during the Revolutionary War in America, people don't really know that much about him, and I bet you as another generation or two go by, at least here in America, people just kind of forget about him altogether. Well, that's the case with R.H. Malden. He was a guy who wrote some ghost stories and made a name for himself in the time, but now no one's got anything to say about him. For example, it says in Wikipedia, he was born in the 19th of October, 1879, and died in August 1951. The Dean of Wells was a prominent Anglican churchman editor, classical and biblical scholar, and writer of ghost stories. And that's it. There's a small blurb about his life, like where he went to school, and that's kind of it. Poor guy's got nothing else. So, with that, let's dive into our story. The 13th Tree by R.H. Malden. If, as I incline to think, architecture in general, and domestic architecture in particular, is the best expression of the characteristics of the period which it belongs, there would be a good deal to be said in favor of having been born soon after the year 1570. Late Tudor and early... This is already not sounding good. Late Tudor and early Jacobin houses always seem to me to exhibit the qualities which I admire most. They are dignified and beautiful, without conscious effort, both inside and out, and I find them extremely satisfying. This, I say to myself, is what a country house ought to be. They look as if they had grown from the soil as naturally as the trees in their parks. They are... as they were because men who planned them were solid, dignified, and sure of themselves. Castles speak of violence and cruelty until they become an anachronism. When there are sights to be seen rather than houses to live in, early Tudor houses have some upstart about them. It's as if they just be suspected had their owners had their own. Moving on, the Paladin palaces of the 18th century are not free from ostentation. They were meant to display the wealth and the taste of their owners, most of whom have probably made the grand tour. Despite their dignity and internal comfort, I can never feel that they belong to the English countryside, but the type of house which was built about 20 years on either side of 1600 always seemed to me to escape all these defects. One of them was the scene of the story, which I am now going to tell. Oh, good. This is going somewhere. I thought it was just going to be about architecture. It is situated in one of the western counties. That is as much as I shall say about the geographical position, as I do not want to bring the Society for Spectral Investigations or any similar body about my ears of those of the neighborhood. It's starting to sound like Dan Aykroyd. I had never known the owner. When we were boys, our paths in life had diverged. For 30 years or more, we never met. We came across each other accidentally in London, and both welcomed the opportunity of resuming an old friendship. When he asked me to visit him, I was very glad to accept his invitation. Accordingly, a few weeks later, on a fine day early in October, I caught a train to Paddington for my journey westwards. Now, I'm familiar with Paddington. I've read Paddington Bear. I've made an acquaintance with the first 20 miles of the Great Western in the year 1890. And for some time after that, it had been very familiar to me and had not traveled by that route for a good many years. Was horrified to see how the Great Wen, as Coblet rudely called London, spread over what I remembered a pleasant countryside. One of the few things which did not seem to be altered since I had passed that way last was a building of really exceptional ugliness. A hotel, I believe, close to the station at Slough. For I think the first time in my life the sight of it gave me real pleasure. I had to change 3 times in the course of my journey, and it was, gross, like your pants? It was nearly 5 o'clock when I got, trains, out in the country station, where my host met me. The light was falling then. We arrived at the house, and I could only see it was large, and that it promised to be very beautiful. I was introduced to my hostess and her 2 daughters, and after tea, the hall in front of a superb log fire and a large open fireplace. My host took me to the smoking room. I had no idea you're such a territorial magnet, I said to him when we had settled down. I never expected to be, he said. My father was a parson in the north, and I became a solicitor in York, as you know. We lived outside New York, or just York, for the first 15 years after I was married. I knew of this place, but never saw it until I succeeded a distant cousin, for whom I saw nearly 7 years ago. He was unmarried and a queer-tempered old chap by all accounts. Perhaps the fact that he had Never seen me influence his choice of an heir. Is he still talking? Because the quotes haven't stopped. Oh, yeah, this is just a big, long speech he's making. The place isn't entailed, and there are several distant relations besides me. It's a curious thing, but the property has never passed in the district male line since Sir Robert Newton, whose portrait you'll see in the dining room, bought it and built the house. About the year 1602, I believe. He was the Chief Justice of Queen's Bench. His son was drowned in the pool in our garden. It does not exist now. It was filled in immediately afterwards. No one could ever understand how the boy got into it, or why, having got in, he couldn't get out. It's quite shallow. I believe he was more than a child. There was a daughter who married and brought her family here after her parents died, but her son was killed at Naseby, leaving several daughters. And so it goes on. Either there was no son, or he hasn't lived to inherit. My immediate predecessor succeeded a childless uncle. I'm really having a tough time reading. It's kind of early in the day, too. I'm used to reading at night. Not like I do any better then, either. And I really was glad I never had a son, as I'm sure my wife would be nervous about bringing him here. Indeed, I don't mind admitting that I think it should be. Of course, the village people say there's a curse on the place, and they don't know why. I can't think that my respected ancestor, he is my ancestor, if by no means direct line, was likely to have done anything to provoke one. That is his giant speech. Certainly, when I looked at the portrait an hour or two later, I could detect nothing evil in it. That suggested that Sir Robert had been a shrewd and kindly person, who would probably be as lenient on the bench as the law allowed him to be. No doubt he had passed many sentences in his time which we should think harsh or even savage, but that would not have been the view of his contemporaries. After dinner, we sat in the library. It was a large room, completely lined with well-filled bookcases whose contents looked as if they would repay examination. There was no saying that may not have been wandered to such a place, such as any oyster may contain a pearl of price. I asked whether there was a catalog. Not a very good one, was the answer. In fact, I'm not sure that I shan't spend a good part of the winter trying to improve it. You'd like to have a look around tomorrow, I expect. I got many of the books belong to Sir Robert. By the way, when you put in what you said, it been said in his bedroom, it's often used, but we've just had to take up the floors in some of the rooms near ours. Dry rot. Pretty bad too. But I think you might be comfortable there. No, there's no story about it that I've heard. We don't run into a ghost of any kind. We went upstairs soon afterwards, and while I was undressing, I meditated upon a queer fatality which seemed to have pursued the family for 300 years. Was it more than a series of odd, unfortunate coincidences? Are there, or have there been, people who, some malign power which they would direct against their enemies? Or is it somehow the power operative at their lifetime? Did it exhaust itself after a period of time, or not? I had finished undressing before I had arrived at a satisfactory answer to any of these conundrums. When I was ready for bed, I went to the window and opened it and drew back the curtains, as was my custom. It was a clear night, with a good deal of moon. My room was on the first floor at the back of the house, overlooking part of the garden, which I had not seen before. Immediately below me lay a gravel terrace, bounded on the far side by the stone balustrade. And on the other side of this, at the lower level and reached by the flight of steps, lay a small formal garden. In the middle was a circular stone basin, where I hoped there might be a fountain. Round the edge stood a number of dark, eclipsed trees, yews or cypresses, which I could tell not which. There were 12 of these, one at each corner, two in between. On the far side was a low stone wall separating the garden from the park beyond. Very white it looked in the moonlight, almost as if it were newly built. But in the middle there were a park, a dark patch, ivy or creeper, I suppose, and amid a clump on the coping, which then spread in a way that was almost suggestive of the head and the arms of the person in the act of climbing the wall. I thought rather ugly and decided that if I were the owner, I would have it removed. Then I went to bed. For some reason, sleep did not come as quickly as usual, and I was visited with pictures, half dreams and half waking, which belonged to the borderline of consciousness. Mine made 2 scenes. On the first, I found myself seated in a large, old-fashioned traveling coach. Beside me was a figure very much wrapped up. I turned toward me once, as if about to speak, and I could recognize the original of the portrait in the dining room. Presently, we were brought to a standstill by a great concourse of people who seemed to be streaming away from some spectacle. I put my head out the window to see what it was, but drew it again quickly. A few yards in front of us was a gallows. There were 4 bodies dangling from the crossbeam. As I sat down, feeling as if I should be sick, my head poked into the window on the other side, and it belonged to a young man. His face seemed unnaturally pale. There was something else unusual about it, but I could not take in what it was. The young man said something in a low tone to my companion, and I could not catch the words, but they seemed to disconcert him very much. Next moment, the face had vanished, and we begun to move again, and I found myself murmuring, "An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." The second scene, it was a churchyard by night. A funeral was taking place, and I could see the bearers and the men with the torches and the priest. There appeared to be no mourners, unless I were one. The coffin was lowered into the grave. Some bird of the night gave a long and dolorous screech very close overhead. At this I woke. I think there must have been a hunting owl or a nightjar outside my window. As I did not wish for any repetition of such scenes, I got a book and read until I could feel confident that I should sleep more soundly. When I went to my window the next morning, I received a surprise. There was to be, as to be expected, it was the garden, which I had looked the night before, but there were no trees, no pool, and I could see no growth upon the wall at the bottom. Yet I knew that I had seen those things, and that I had not been dreaming at the time. I decided to say nothing about it to my host. He knew whether the pool in which Sir Robert's son had been drowned had been, but he did not. I noticed that the wall between the garden and the park, it did not look as new as I thought it had the night before. It seemed to be the same age as the rest of the house. It seemed to be expected. It might, however, be due to the difference between daylight and moonlight. The day was fine, and as the neighborhood was new to me, most of the hours of the daylight were passed out of doors. After tea, we were sitting in the library, and I asked my host whether he knew why or by whom the curse had been laid upon Sir Robert's descendants. Well, oh God, is this going to be another big long speech? Yes, it is. Great. Said, I'm not going to read it in the same voice. Said he, there's a bit of a story about it, but all I know is it is very incomplete and doesn't explain much. It seems that the old judge's time, there was a woman in the village who's reputed to be a witch. Nothing very out of the way about that. In fact, you wouldn't have to look very far to find witches, or reputed ones, in the West Country. Villages today. Her name was Miriam Urch. Urch is quite a common name in these parts. But they say she was at the bottom of it. But I don't know why she would have to have had a down on the Newtons. All right, whatever. And as nothing was ever proved against her that was given a Christian burial in the churchyard, but her time came. You can see that is said to be her grave close to the north door. I expect it is. Village tradition is generally pretty accurate in such points. They are quite as sure whether she is always in it, though, even now. I believe the rector has had something to say to old Job Dixon, the sexton, about its untidiness more than once, but he says it isn't his fault. There are no other graves anywhere near it, and I don't think there will be as long as there's a scrap of room anywhere else. No more was said on the topic that evening, and the hours after dinner passed pleasantly with a game of bridge with my host, his 2 daughters. They were all agreed that the games were games, and though through due respect must be paid to the rules which govern them, they ought not to be transformed into hard and dismal forms of work. It was near midnight before I found myself in my room, and when I was ready for bed, I admit that I hesitated for a moment before drawing back my curtains. Finally, curiosity prevailed. If there was anything to be seen, I might as well see it. It seemed unlikely that any harm could come to me or to the family through me. I looked out, and the moon shone brilliantly, and there, beyond any possibility of mistake, were the pool and the 12 trees. Taking a sip of my coffee. Were there only 12? My first impression was that there was more. That was absurd. I counted them again, and to make sure, and as I had thought, that there was at each corner, with a 2 in between. And as soon as I looked at them all together, I got the impression that there were more. But I could not have said where the additional one, I felt sure there was one, was. Nor even whether it had always been the same place, and I noticed that the ivy, or whatever it had been on the wall at the bottom, was gone. It might have been cleared away during the day, but I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone or something had come over and was dodging about behind the trees. If so, with what intent? I began to feel an overpowering desire to go and investigate, yet I could hardly do that. The door leading to the terrace was doubtless locked and bolted, and I should be sure to disturb someone in getting it open. What could I say if I did? And I thought it was fine night for a stroll, and that I always found pajamas was most comfortable wear for nocturnal ramble. I felt quite certain, I don't know why, that the trees and pool would be inevitable to anyone except myself. All the same, the desire to investigate more closely grew stronger and stronger, and I have never seen or experienced hypnotism, but began to feel as if I imagined a hypnotic subject does. It seemed as if I were being dragged out by some force which was overpowering my own will, and that if I could not get the door open, I should have to jump from my first-floor window. This would never do. As an antidote, I began to recite the first thing which came in my head. It happened to be the Battle of Lake Regillus from Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. And not for the first time, I blessed the wisdom of my mother, who made us learn quantities of poetry by heart as soon as we could read. This particular poem had been my first major achievement in this line. I'd always remained particularly distinct in my memory because the recitation of it had won 2.5 crowns from a godfather. None of this is I don't have to be in the story at all. This is way too much detail around why he's singing this thing. And thereby has enabled me to understand, for the first time, last time in my life, what is meant by the possession of wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. Doesn't matter. Doesn't need to be in it. I am not quite sure whether I declaimed it aloud or not, but I know that I had only got to the end of the first stanza. But the proud Ides, when the squadron rides, shall be Rome's whitest day. I like the way I read that. Reading in the daytime is a whole different... I have a way different energy I'm bringing to this thing than at night. When the spell, which I was quite sure had been malevolent, broke, and I was completely my own master again, I felt as one does when a motor car or bicycle has skidded and a disaster in a ditch has been escaped by inches. I stopped at the window because I felt sure that something was going to happen. I didn't have to wait long. A figure appeared on the terrace. Where it had come from, I did not see. When it emerged from the shadow of the house, I saw that it was of a young man, not much more than a boy. He seemed to be dressed as a young gentleman of quality. Should have been about the year 1600 or a little later. For some reason, this did not surprise me. I wondered whether I was spying upon a lovers' meeting. The moonlight was all that could be desired. If the air were a little chilly, but there was no second figure to be seen. He went down the stone steps leading from the terrace to the garden below and advanced to the edge of the pool. He stood there a minute, or two, looking down to the water. Perhaps he was admiring the reflection of the moon, and when a very horrid thing happened. A vague black shape darted from behind one of the trees and flung itself upon him. It lay on top of him, and it obviously forced him into the pool face downwards with the intent to drown him. I tried to shout. What good would it have been done? I don't know. But no sound came. I thought of going to the rescue, but found myself unable to move. Of course, that would have been equally futile. Could I have got there the next minute, a heavy bank of cloud, which had been creeping up from the southwest, drove across the moon, and I could see no more. There was no sound to be heard. How long I remained looking out the window into the blackness and the silence, I cannot say. Presently I found that I could move again. So crept into bed. There's nothing more which could have done. I think I slept more than might have been expected. Next morning, when we went to the library after breakfast, I decided that I must make an effort to tell my host what I had seen. It did need an effort, for I felt very unwilling to speak about it. I don't know why. I didn't think I was afraid of being laughed at, and if I were told that I had been dreaming, I could only reply that I knew that I had been awake. Somehow that made me the more reluctant. However, I took the plunge. He listened to my story very attentively and obviously took it seriously. When I had finished, he said, I think we know not how poor young Newton came to his end, but who do you suppose it was that fell upon him? Miss Urch? If so, why? Neither of us said anything more for a little while, and then I could see that, like Odysseus, on more than one occasion, he was this way and that, dividing his swift mind. And he said, yes, I think there's sufficient reason. Wait for a bit. We were sitting beside the fireplace as the morning was chilly, and we went to the other end of the room, climbed to the top of a short stepladder, and took a smallish tin box from the end of the shelf. I saw that it was tied up with a string or tape, and there was a seal over the knot. There was a label attached on which was written, it looked like an early 18th century hand, Sir Robert Newton, Secreta, all right, not to be opened without sufficient reason. Well, I said. Well, he replied. Don't you think there is now? Of course I agreed, and the string was cut. Most important part of the contents was a notebook. The handwriting was Elizabethan, and a brief inspection satisfied us that the book had belonged to the judge. It was not exactly a diary. By no means were all the entries dated, and there did not seem to have been any attempt to produce a complete record of the period covered, which amounted to several years. There was a number of rather cryptic notes, apparently relating to the cases which he tried, whether there was meant to direct his summoning up or was merely private memoranda was not easy to decide. Neither of us was an expert paleographer and decipherer. Them all would obviously take some time, so we put the book aside for the moment. There were several letters from Lady Newton, from which it was to be inferred that she had gone down to the west to supervise the completion of the furnishing of the new house, while her husband was detained by work in London. These told not an unfamiliar tale of dilatory workmen, of things ordered at a distance which were not delivered on the day appointed for, so forth. She also feared that when all done, the original estimate would be very much exceeded. It would have been very interesting had she mentioned the sums, but unfortunately she did not. These belonged to the years 1599, 1600, as one of them referred to the good effect produced by, quote, your visit. It would appear that the judge had made an excursion to the scene of action to see whether he could expedite matters and alleviate some of his wife's troubles. How many more pages of this do we have? Kind of a lot. God damn it. I'm bored. I'm just going to say it. Underneath, there was a largish sheet of paper, which had been folded more than once. This proved to be a plan of the house and gardens, obviously by a professional hand. Will you not be surprised to hear that in the middle of the small garden below the terrace was a circle of considerable size, which obviously indicated a pool. At the distance, some yards were 12 dots at regular intervals, forming a square to show where it was intended to place the statues or plant trees or something of the sort. The plan itself did not state what form or ornament the architect had in mind, but I was in a position to say trees, not statues. There's only one more paper. It's merely a list of about 100 names, presumably those of the inhabitants of the village, who were all the judge's tenants. This was dated May 7th, 1603, which my host thought must have been very soon after Sir Robert had come to reside permanently in his new home, and suggested that he began to devote himself seriously to the duties of the country gentleman. The name of the Miriam Urch appeared among them. It was marked with an asterisk that there was nothing noting or relating to her to be found. She must have lived alone. as the names were obviously arranged according to their households, and there were no other Urches in the village. Beyond establishing trustworthiness of tradition up to a point, he did not get us much further. Still, it was something to know that, witch or not, she really had existed, and that there did seem to have been some special point of contact, however small, between her and the judge. At this moment, lunch was announced, so our investigation was suspended. When we felt disposed to resume our researches, I suggested that it might be worthwhile to ask the rector for permission to examine the register of burials at the church. Supposing it to be in existence, so much was destroyed wantonly during the Commonwealth period, it was not uncommon to find no records prior to 1662. Here, however, we were in luck. The registers were complete from 1558 onwards. May 7th, 1603 was our terminus acquio, whatever. And we found the entry of the burial Miriam Urch on November 4th of that year. She had died on October 31st. Ooh, and there's an asterisk in the margin at the footnote of the page, and we thought another hand, but could not be sure. Under ye yew tree by ye north door. There was only note appended to the entry of the volume. It might be presumed that her estate was not sufficient to provide a headstone for the grave, so that no one else was prepared to bear the expense. Also, that somebody, whether at the time or afterwards, was anxious that the site should not be forgotten. We turned on. The entries were few, as the population of the village was small. We found a burial of Philip Newton, aged 19 years, on November 7, 1604. He had died 3 days before. I said, coincidences do happen. This seems a little too close not to have been arranged. We know, more or less, how it was done, but I wonder why. There must be a story of some kind behind it. Our only remaining source of information was the judge's notebook, so we turned to that. The next day was so wet that there was nothing to distract us. So we became familiar with his hand, and we found that we could read most of it without much difficulty. The impression, this is also not necessary, the impression of which we had formed in our first cursory inspection was confirmed. There was a number of disconnected memoranda relating to a variety of matters. Some were dated, but not all. They seemed to cover the last 10 or 12 years of his term upon the bench. Some were concerned with the cases which he had heard, others with purely domestic matters. Some were too short to be fully intelligible. It looked as if it had been Sir Robert's practice to put down from time to time whatever happened to be passing through his mind. Not necessarily every day, without attempting to keep a systematic diary. One of the longest entries was a very noble prayer, apparently his own composition, that he might be enabled to do justice in the fear of God and with no fear of man. Shortly after, there was the prayer for forgiveness of any failure, and it was clear that he had been a conscientious judge and set himself a high standard. Interesting as much as this was, it was not relevant to the immediate purpose. We got almost to the last page before we came upon anything which threw any light on the subject of the investigation. How many more pages do I have? I got one more. The last case which he heard before his retirement, or at any rate the last which he was on any record, was of the 4 men for highway robbery committed on Hounslow Heath. Their names were given: Robert Houston, William Parrott, Edward Backhouse, and George Urch. The first 3 were bracketed together with the words "taken red-handed" written against them, but for some reason the case against George Urch seemed to have been less clear. His name was followed by a few jottings. Taken next day. No good alibi. Identified an oath. Then followed 2 or 3 lines which were quite illegible. Below them the words "condemned with others." The only other entries were purely personal after this trial, but at the interval in which it was impossible to say, both his health and his spirits seemed to have been affected. Twice he recorded, "kept my chamber all day." Once he had sent for the apothecary, to whom he had paid 2 shillings and 2 sixpence. Another entry showed that he had paid a visit to the rector, S. Margaret Westminster. This ended with the word "comforted." from which it would appear that whether his trouble was not entirely physical, at this time his wife and family must have been elsewhere, as he spoke of arranging for his man, whose name was Edward Hylar, to lie in the chamber next to mine. More than once had E.H. to sit with me in the parlor. It was a reasonable guess that George Burp Urch, the highwayman, was the son of Miriam Urch. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of alerts. It's, daytime, not nighttime. I get a lot of action. And then there was within their knowledge Sir Robert sent him to his death. Whether justly or not would be perhaps concerned with her closely, and the judge's own jotting suggested that there might have been a miscarriage of justice, involuntary on his part. She seemed to have her revenge, in the strictest sense of the word, but she did not live to see it. We returned to the churchyard. Traditions called her grave could be identified without difficulty, as there were no others near it, but there was no vestige of any yew tree. There was, however, a shallow depression, roughly circular and of considerable extent, close to it. We had recourse to the rector again, not without apologies. He was able to tell us that he believed that there had been a tree there, and that there were one or two old people living in the place who might remember something about it. He promised to ascertain what he could, and added that, while he did not wish to appear discourteous, he thought he would be more likely to be successful if he pursued the investigations alone. Ugh. So wordy to get to the point. He had some information for us the next day. There had been a yew tree there, which had been blown down in a terrible storm, not long after Victoria became queen. It was more than 200, that's with a apostrophe, UNDERD, year old. But it were a good riddance. No explanation of this was forthcoming. Wood Rector had roots grubbed and tooken away and burned. When the men got under there, it was girt toward settin'. And he spit at they who queried devilishly, that they were frit and run for the rector. When they come back and were gone, never saw with a Z no more. Rector came back wi' him. Some things were found bits o' bone, and such like. Rector he wrapped up so that they took they away to burn. This from the very ancient man whose father had been employed on the work. He had heard his father and mother talking about it since they thought he was asleep. There had been more said, but that was all that he could remember. Now, I conjectured that the storm was that of the January 6th to 7th, 1839, which seems to have been a little less violent than its better-known forerunner of November 1703. It came from the northwest, inter Allah, and it did considerable damage to Bishop Longley's new place in Palace at Ripon. The churchwarden's accounts were available and showed considerable expenditure on repairs of the church. Oh my God, so they're finding a record of the storm and the repairs. We don't really need to read that, do we? Nature not specified in the churchyard of February and March that year. Well, I said, it's about as much as we're ever likely to know. I doubt whether Mrs. Urch could do any more mischief. If she likes to give a reputation of original performance, now and again, I expect the tree, which should have been quite a small one in her time, was necessary somehow. There seem to be unaccountable but very rigid rules governing these things. Perhaps we shall understand them better some day. You may be right, said Phillipson, and I don't think I have mentioned his name before. He actually put that in the story. Oh, God, you didn't need to put that in the story. Now I come to think of it, there hadn't been a direct male heir at any time since 1839 for her to try her hand on. All the same, I wonder. I was not much surprised to hear a few months later that Mr. Phillipson thought the house was far too expensive and that he was conveying it to the National Trust and going to live elsewhere. I believe that it is uninhabited now, so that if Mrs. Urch ever returns to it, no one will be any the wiser or the worse. I have heard that the trustees would like to restore the sunken garden, according to the plan found amongst Sir Robert's papers. But Mr. Phillipson is opposed to this, and while they think him rather unreasonable, they feel bound to respect his wishes. Well, that was just about the dumbest thing I ever read. Let's try to find something positive in this. What was good about this story? Well, you had one moderately creepy part where he goes to the window and he sees the shape of some little boy or whatever going to the pool that's not supposed to be there, and then a shadowy figure going out and drowning him. Yeah, so that was good. That made it kind of creepy. What sucks about it? Pretty much all the rest of the book. As soon as you have that creepy part, it's filled up with him reciting poetry so that he doesn't get, taken over by some kind of trance. Then he explains why he learned the poetry, what he learned the poetry from, how much money did he get as a reward for learning it as a little kid. And then after that, they go into documentation. Maybe solving a mystery through reading paperwork is exciting to some people, but it wasn't exciting to me. What did we learn? We learned that people's idea of what was scary back then was far different than us. Or maybe whereas I get bored reading something like that, they were terrified by it. Oh, this is mundane. And their skin starts to goose pimple up, and the hair on the back of their neck stands up. I don't know, whatever the deal is, but I also learned that if I'm recording early enough in the day, I have a tough time reading. I was slipping up on words all over the damn place. Doesn't help that I'm not reading this on my Kindle, and I'm reading it on a paper book with the smallest font in the world. All right, I'm done complaining. Well, with that, thanks for listening, and I will see you on the next episode.